Welcome to the Jay Kim Show, Hong Kong's first dedicated podcast on investing in Asia. Join us as we survey the land and discover the greatest companies and most profitable investment opportunities in Asia. If this is your first time listening, thank you for stopping by. This podcast is produced every week with the goal of providing actionable insights to you, the listener, with every single episode. And now, on to the show. This week's show guest is Kim Iskyan, who is the publisher at Stansberry Churchouse Research. Kim spent more than the past 25 years exploring and analyzing global markets. He's been a director of research for a large emerging market investment bank, a hedge fund manager, and also an advisor for Fortune 50 companies on political risk. Kim has lived and worked in 10 countries, including Spain, Russia, Sri Lanka, and the United States, and he now lives in Singapore. Kim, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jay, how are you? Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm glad that we can connect and you can get back on the show, and I'm excited to catch up and hear about all the cool stuff that you're working on. But before we do that, I think my introduction there actually didn't do justice, because you have probably one of the most diverse backgrounds that I know of, and I thought I had a diverse background because I grew up overseas as well. But you definitely far surpassed me. So maybe you could give our audience a little bit of your background, where you came from and how you came up and how you became an investor.
Great. I was born in the U.S., Jay, and moved around. I've lived in 10 states in the U.S. in total. But when I was a kid, I moved to Spain. I grew up in Madrid, and my mother is from the Netherlands, and we traveled around a whole lot in Europe as I was growing up. And then I went to college and grad school in the U.S., and I wound up going to the former Soviet Union and lived in Armenia. I lived in Russia for 9 years. I worked for a few investment banks, and I ran a hedge fund there, as you mentioned. I lived in Kyrgyzstan. I lived in Sri Lanka and Mexico for a while, in the Netherlands. And it's kind of funny, over time, boundaries and barriers and borders kind of blur. And it's the world is seamless in a lot of ways, especially now with technology and depending on the passport you have, travel. And I think just to wind this back around to being an investor, I think that as an investor, when you start to see borders, it's only going to hurt you, because money flows everywhere. And if you view the entire world as your potential investment platform, and you, to the extent possible, you ignore nationality and culture and language, I think you're going to be a long way ahead of most people who get kind of caught up in all sorts of issues that are kind of irrelevant to investing.
Right. I think that's that's very, very true. And we'll talk about that more in depth. I know that you talk about it a lot, and trying to get out of that sort of home country bias that a lot of people, especially in the West, have, particularly in the US. I know for a fact that they do. Kim, I'm just curious. So you mentioned you spent some time in Madrid. So I gathered that you speak Spanish. And then you said you also were educated in the States. So what was it? Army? I get the same question because I lived abroad a lot. Was it like a military background, or was it just an international family that you have?
No, it's kind of funny. My dad, as a college student in the early '60s, he traveled around. He was American, but he traveled around Europe, and he liked Spain a whole lot. So years later, he was a nuclear engineer. He was safety. He looked at safety systems for nuclear power plants. And in the U.S., the nuclear power industry was contracting in the 70s, and then that was accelerated with the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979. So he had to pretty much go where the work was. And Spain's nuclear power industry was just evolving. So he said, well, let me see if I can find a job in Spain. So we wound up moving to Madrid. And it was, it's funny, Spain now is very much integrated as part of it. It's European, both in fact and geographically. But at the time when I lived there, it was, the expression was that Europe ended at the Pyrenees. And Spain was, strictly speaking, part of Europe, but it was not part of the EU until the late 80s. And it was really a developing country in a lot of ways. So it's extraordinary how countries develop and how the perceptions of countries can develop over just a few decades.
Absolutely. I think when we first connected last year, I think we had a conversation about myself. I also grew up overseas in Saudi Arabia, and before this Aramco IPO, like no one had ever really even thought about it. And, since the Gulf War. I mean, people kind of forgot about that, and then all of a sudden, everyone's like, "Oh, Saudi Aramco, oh right, Saudi Arabia." But I definitely think that it had an influence on me being able to travel overseas and internationally. And I imagine it's the same for you. What took you to the Soviet Union? Did you spend any time on Wall Street first and then take a job over there, or was it straight out of the gates?
No, it was. I studied Latin American history in graduate school, and then I did the logical thing and moved to New York and got a job on Wall Street. And my hook was that I spoke Spanish,
Right.
and Latin American stock markets in the mid '90s were just taking off. So I wandered around and met people and called up alumni from the university where I went to and said, "Hey, can you meet me for a cup of coffee?" And I eventually found a job as a sales assistant at a mid-tier investment bank on the sales desk for Latin American institutional equity sales, and just learned one thing. How these things go. You're in the middle of it. You learn a whole lot, and you learn a lot more than if you would spend 2 years, trying to get an MBA or studying finance or whatever. It was all learn as you go.
Right.
And from there, to address your question, I wound up hooking up with a contract with the U.S. government, because the U.S. government in the late '90s mid to late '90s was looking at the former Soviet Union and said, "Well, gosh, they just escaped communism. We have to be sure that they don't go back to communism. So why don't we create stock markets in some of the countries of the former Soviet Union, since as part of the privatization process, employees of factories and companies had been given privatization vouchers. That is, all these companies have been state-owned. And then one day they said, guess what? The state no longer exists in that way. So you, Mr. and Mrs. Factory Worker, you own part of this company now."
Wow, that's pretty cool.
So Uncle Sam went in and said, "Hey, why don't we create a venue for these new shareholders to be able to trade their shares?" And so I went to a country called Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia that borders northwest China and is south of Kazakhstan to help build a stock market.
That's pretty, wow. Yeah.
It was it was exciting. It was extraordinary, and I've wandered through. Really, Kyrgyzstan you can barely find on a map, and we're talking 20 plus years ago. To make a phone call, you had to call the operator first, and then the operator could make the phone call for you. It was that kind of place. And I went to the most remote places of one of the more remote countries in the world to sit down with factory managers who, in their office, they had a huge picture of Lenin. So this guy is sitting on a portrait of Lenin. I'm telling him about a stock market and why he should list his company's shares on a stock market. It was I didn't quite appreciate it at the time, but it was pretty surreal.
That is incredible. Was there any sort of safety concerns that you had when you were doing this work?
No, Kyrgyzstan it wasn't really a factor. It was peaceful, and they subsequently went through 2 revolutions in the span of 8 or 10 years. But this was well before that, and it was a beautiful, nice country. The stock market still exists. I visited a couple of years ago, but it doesn't have much volume, as you might guess.
Right.
And then from there, I went to on a different contract. I went to Moscow on a World Bank contract, and the Russian stock market was taking off. And I knew just enough about the world of finance from my 2 years on Wall Street, and just enough about that part of the world from my year plus in Kyrgyzstan and Russia. So I got a job with a local brokerage house, and that was, Jay, there's some times in history where you're at the right place at the right time with just the right combination of skills, and you're very fortunate that everything comes together.
Right.
Because with the skills I had, if I had been in New York, I would have been, some junior analyst wherever in some boring investment bank cubicle farm. But in Moscow, I could string together a sentence in English. I could perform basic financial analysis. I could speak some Russian, and I was golden in relative terms.
Right.
So yeah, so I wound up being there for 9 years and worked for a few investment banks and was head of research for a while for one of them. Um, and and then I later on lived in Armenia when I met my wife in Moscow, and then her job took us to Armenia. And I'm of Armenian descent. My last name is Armenian.
Oh, really? Okay. I was gonna ask you, but I was gonna ask you offline. What? But there you go. I was wondering what Iskyan was. There you go. Okay, it's very cool. Do you still have relatives there, or is it long?
No, no. The history of Armenia was a lot of people of Armenian descent. They lost their relatives there in the genocide in
Right.
1915 through 1918, and my great great grandfather actually fled well before then.
Hmm.
So and he fled what is now sort of eastern Turkey. So no, is a short answer. But one of the cool things about countries like that is you go back and you say, hey, you know what, my great grandfather left, and they say, oh, you've come home.
Right.
And even though I'm kind of light and I have blue eyes, and Armenians are kind of swarthy and Mediterranean looking, they still say, "Oh no, you're just like one of us. You're actually before Armenians became dark haired and dark complexion, they were light. So you're one of the original Armenians."
There you go. Very cool.
So
Very cool. Spain, Russia, or U.S. for a bit, Russia, Armenia, all these places that you've lived in. Now Singapore. Which one's your favorite? I mean, I know that's hard to say, but is there one place that just stuck out at you? Think looking back.
I think a lot of that has to do with what you're doing and where you are in your life.
Mm,
And I had a fantastic time in Moscow because it was an incredibly dynamic time, and everything was changing, and the country didn't really know where it was going, and it was hugely exciting. But I was young and wasn't married, didn't have kids, and it would be a very different proposition. It was a very different proposition when I was married with kids years later.
right.
A
Sure.
whole lot, just much more difficult. A huge, dirty city where it's cold 6 months out of the year, and then I think to answer your question, I think Sri Lanka would probably have to uh, to take the crown. It's Sri Lanka is a beautiful country, incredibly diverse. It's remote, just this little island to the south of India, but it's incredibly diverse in terms of culture, in terms of geography. The food is amazing. I really loved it there. I think, but again, with kids, it's a little bit more difficult.
Yeah,
so
for
so
sure.
it's always a balance of different things.
Very cool background. I totally agree with you. I think when I was younger, I spent a year in Tokyo. I was working at Lehman Brothers, and they sent me over there for a year, and it was I was career wise, I was just a scrub. I was an analyst, and I was a nobody. But I think it was just the time of my life. I was young, I was single, and I just had a good time. And I always have fond memories when I go back there. But so okay, so let's so tell us. I mean, now obviously you have a family, and you're living in a first world country, the city state of Singapore, which is also one of my favorite cities. My wife absolutely loves Singapore because now that we have kids, it's very very kid friendly. I live in Hong Kong, and you know how it is up here. It's all hustle and bustle and very kid unfriendly. So she goes there every summer actually for about a month with the kids. So what led you down there, and what are you working on these days currently?
Well, about 5 years ago, we moved to the U.S. and I was looking for something interesting to do, and I got in touch with an independent investment research firm and newsletter publisher called Stansberry Research, and
Hmm.
I'd been in touch with them before and spoken with them, and I said, "Well, I'm back. I'd love to work for you." And they said, "Well, we'd like somebody to write a publication that looks at out of favor markets around the world, um, and to find different investment angles." And I said, "I'm your guy." so, uh, so I went to places everywhere from Venezuela to Iran to Macau, to Argentina, to Kazakhstan, and wander around, talk to people, found some sort of investable angle if there was one, or said, "Look, this place is off the radar, and it's off the radar for good reason." And then after a few years, we decided, well, we're going to leave the U.S. because we didn't need to live there anymore after my wife quit her job. And Stansberry said, well, we were thinking of developing a business in Asia. Would
Right.
you be interested in helping us out? And I said, fantastic. So I came to Singapore to develop an investment research firm that's really focused on publishing investment newsletters for individual investors in Asia, as well as people in the rest of the world who are interested in investing in Asia and better understanding the investment potential and opportunities in this part of the world.
I think that So for the audience listening in, I think that and I'm Kim. I'm new to financial publishing myself. I actually didn't know anything about it until maybe 2 years ago, because having come up through the institutional side of things, you don't really get that exposed to it, especially not out here in Asia. I think maybe if you're in the U.S., you're probably quite familiar with, Stansberry is quite a household name, as is, Agora Financial and the likes. But, I hadn't really heard of it. And when I started learning about it, it was eye opening, because basically you get, like you said, you get all this great research from sort of like institutional caliber research that any sort of individual can access through a newsletter. And it's great specifically. And I think that your value proposition, being sort of in Asia and being a global guy, I think it's much stronger. If I was sitting in the US, I don't think I would care to subscribe to another US stock newsletter. But for people that might be sitting in the U.S. and they just want to know what's going on overseas, I think it's a tremendous value proposition. So what are the different types of publications that you guys have?
Well, I think, Jay, just to add what you just said, I think that the whole value proposition also is that individual investors are at a pretty big disadvantage anywhere in the world, because they well, on the one hand, you have technology, and in the past 10, 15 years, I think a lot of people said, well, with technology and with the ability to be able to access, financial reports and research and news so easily, it's kind of leveled the playing field for institutions and individuals. So as an individual, I have access to all sorts of information that 15 years ago would have taken me days to put together. Right. But I think that kind of ignores the other side of technology, and that's everything from algorithms to the sheer human manpower that institutions can put to work for analysis. And despite technology, I think when you look at how an individual investor who's not a professional investor, he or she is someone with a day job who doesn't have all day to devote to his investments. It's right. It's kind of like playing on the JV team and saying, okay, you're playing in the NBA now. There's really
that's a good analogy, actually.
It's there's a huge disadvantage. So what we try to do at Stansberry Churchouse Research, and what Stansberry Research tries to do too, is to go to individual investors and say, look, we can help you kind of bridge the gap and understand some of the things that some of the language, some of the terminology, some of the context. Because if you open up the Wall Street Journal today, you can learn all sorts of things, but unless you understand the context of it and what it all means, how it all kind of fits together, you look at inflation figures and you look at political issues and you look at macroeconomic data, and you say, okay, but what does that mean? And I think that's the tricky thing, and that's where we try to piece it all together and say, okay, this is what it all means, and these are some investment ideas that you, Mr. or Mrs. individual investor, can use to capitalize on this and try to make money yourself. So we have a free daily e-letter where every day we talk about personal finance and issues in the investing world and economics. And then we have an investment newsletter called the Churchouse Letter that addresses different markets in Asia. And we have investment recommendations that are mostly ADRs, also Hong Kong listed securities. And it's around $99 a year. It's an inexpensive product. Then we have a product that I write that's called International Capitalist, where I look at different markets around the world and stocks that are out of favor or that you wouldn't hear of otherwise, or that are disregarded for some reason, because of the sort of business they're in, or because management is out of favor, or the country is kind of off the radar. And I often go to some of these countries to check them out, to see whether the perception that they're not good places to invest really matches with reality. And then we have a third product is a cryptocurrency product where we look at different cryptocurrency opportunities around in the market.
Yeah, so I think it's a great sort of menu that you guys offer. You Peter, I guess your partner there, and it's his son that does the crypto newsletter. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. Simon Churchouse. Yes.
Yeah. And so I think it's a great sort of blend there that you have, and you kind of get all, crypto is obviously very hot these days, but even just the Church House letter and what you do with your newsletter there, I think you get a very good coverage, base of coverage of international markets. So on your product specifically, and I read a copy of it and it was very good, and I enjoyed it. What tell us a little bit about how you what's your sort of methodology when you go find these sort of out of favor, maybe looking for that asymmetrical bet, maybe going off the beaten path where someone might not be inclined to go to, or looking under rocks, this sort of thing, and finding these great trades? Is there a certain framework that you begin with and follow through to find these trades?
Well, I think I'd call myself a global opportunist. I think that there is always going to be, in the world, there's going to be a market, there's going to be a sector, there's going to be a stock that for some reason is going through a rough patch. And as we all know, rough patches, they can go on for a while, but when they end, they end. And it takes a little while for investors, for markets, for perception to catch up with the changed reality. And I far prefer to find something that's out of favor, where only a few things have to go right and the share price will double or triple, than go someplace and find something that is in favor and everybody's throwing money at it. And if everything goes perfectly, it'll rise another 10%. And if one thing goes wrong, it falls by 50%. So, but I think I would distinguish. I don't really like the term contrarian. I think contrarian, people who say I'm a contrarian, for one thing, they're not, because so few people really are. And I think that also few people should be, because there's a certain reflexive attitude that if everybody likes it, I don't like it. And if nobody likes it, I like it. And you know what? The fact of the matter is just that often if something is out of favor, it deserves to be out of favor. About 4 years ago, I mentioned Venezuela, which at the time was in the throes of post-Chavez chaos. And I thought, this is interesting. And at some point, this will be very interesting, but I don't think yet. And then sure enough, it's still in the throes of chaos, far, far worse 4 years later. So I met a few people there at the time who had been on Wall Street, who had quit. They were of Venezuelan descent, or grown up in Venezuela. And they had gone back home because they said, you know what, I want to be here when things change. And at some point, things are going to change, and assets will be so cheap in this country, and it'll be amazing. And you know what? I'll bet those people are still there, still waiting for that day 4 years later. So anyway, to get back to your question, I really look for opportunities anywhere in the world where assets are out of favor, where assets are cheap for some reason, but where there is a clear catalyst for something to change.
You bring up a very good point, actually, a very interesting point, and a very good point in that, to a certain degree, markets are very efficient. And so, like you said, if something is priced cheap, then there's probably a very good reason for it. And you're probably not this genius that's uncovered this hidden gem. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of, maybe less experienced investors, they'll commonly fall for that. I mean, look, everyone wants to try to find that hidden gem or that asymmetrical bet. And it's a lot harder than most people think. So I think that's quite interesting. As far as is when you look at sort of exotic locations, let's say, How do you screen? What's your initial screening? I mean, the world is huge. There must be. Are there a handful of countries that you're friendly with, that you have local contacts with, that you are your sort of go to hunting grounds?
Yeah, I look for. Well, first I do look for for countries where markets are fundamentally cheap, and or where when you read about them, you only read bad stuff,
Right.
or you don't read about them at all, and you say, "Well, gosh, I know of this country, but I've never hear anything about it. What's up with that?" Um, and yeah, there are some countries where I spent so much time in Russia, and I was an analyst there, so I was very familiar with a lot of the companies for a long time, and I still have a pretty good handle on a lot of different dimensions of the market. Um, but I've worked in a number of markets, visited a lot of markets, and you read different things, you talk to different people, and at some point someone says, "Hey, I'm really looking at this." And it's funny, sometimes I start to dig into an idea and just something kind of clicks, and I think, yes, this idea makes a lot of sense, and it ticks a lot of the boxes that you're looking to tick in terms of valuation, in terms of sort of public profile, in terms of trajectory and what the business is doing, in terms of management. And maybe something was wrong with management, it's been replaced. Maybe something was just askew with the entire business model, and that's been changed. But some dimension where there's been a shift, and that can be both on a company level as well as on a country level, and looking for those sorts of step changes that take time to develop and take time to evolve. So yeah, those are some of the different things that I look for.
Very interesting. We had I love what you're doing, because it's sort of the type of thing that a lot of people wish they can go out and do, but most people can't. They don't. They're too chicken to go to these countries and actually do the research, or B, they just don't have the network or contacts or wherewithal to actually execute. So I think it's pretty cool, and that's why you have this great international capitalist newsletter where you do all the work, and we can just pay the fee and come along for the ride, which I think is great. Now the letter, it's I imagine that it's like a closed subscription at the moment, but you're going to open that up pretty soon for if listeners are interested.
Yes, we will be opening that up quite soon for subscriptions in mid-May.
And what sort of are there actual trade recommendations that a subscriber might get, or is it more of just sort of field research type stuff?
No, they're definitely investment recommendations. A lot of the issue is talking about reviewing a stock and
Right.
explaining the context, and like you would find normally. Only there's stocks that you're not going to see in a lot of other investment newsletters. I'd be willing to bet, because
Right.
they're in markets that are, like I said, markets that are off the radar or out of favor. I can give you one example of the sort of thing that I'd like to do. I went to a few months ago. I visited Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is a country that if you hear about it, it's usually because it's being flooded, or because they just had a horrible garment factory fire. I think those are
Wow.
probably the two reasons that normal people ever hear about Bangladesh. But Bangladesh is actually, for one thing, it has about half the population of the United States. So it's an enormous country in terms of population, but it's geographically the size of Iowa, which is about the size of Nepal. So it's
Right.
extremely small, and you have all these people packed in there. And it's a country that's very poor, so it's starting from a low base. But for literally the past 20 years, it's had growth of somewhere between 5 and 7%, regardless of international or global financial crises or anything else. So it's been growing like really very fast from a low
Wow.
base. Like I said, it's an incredibly difficult place to do business. The World Bank does a survey about how easy it is to do business in different countries, and Bangladesh ranks 176th out of 190 countries. and the capital is periodically rated the least livable city in the world. Uh, so
Nice.
when I was there, I met some people of Bengali descent who had grown up in Vancouver, which I guess is often ranked as the best place in the world
Right.
to live.
Right. Exactly. They made it.
So they were talking about moving from the best place in the world to the worst place in the world. And Dhaka is not. It's not at all an easy place to get around, and but it's a fascinating country, and it's growing so rapidly. And one of the interesting things, if you look at large countries, and you think that are developing, you think, okay, this country needs highways, it needs power, it needs trains, it needs all this sort of infrastructure, and it's a big country. So if you build a highway, it has to go a long way. And one of the strange competitive advantages of Bangladesh is that it is so small. So if you want to put up cell phone towers, you don't need a million of them because it's a relatively small country, and you don't have to have them spread out everywhere. And if you're building a highway, you can build a relatively small highway, and you're connecting the entire country.
Right.
You're not building a highway across Russia. So in terms of development and distribution channels, you can really see how a country like Bangladesh it has some slightly unusual advantages. And because things are such a mess in so many ways, in my mind, but the country's still growing so fast, if it got a few other things right, and if instead of being 176th out of 190 countries, if it was somehow able to scramble up to 120th,
Right.
I mean, that would be an enormous change. And that's it's one of those places that you don't hear about much. But if I had $10,000 that I was looking to put away somewhere and not think about for the next 20 years,
Right.
because this is going to be a country that's going to grow by 7% per year for the next 20 years easily. And economic does not always translate into stock market growth for reasons that we're all very familiar with. But if you have that sort of wind at your back, and that sort of patience, Bangladesh is, I think, a very exciting place. Now, you can only, unless you are ready to be really adventuresome and go in and try to open a local brokerage account, the only real way to invest is through an ETF that's listed in London.
That would be like a country level ETF? Right.
It's country level. It's the ticker in London is XBAN. And that's, an international capitalist, I mostly focus on stocks rather than ETFs because, people aren't all that interested in ETFs, but this is a particular market and situation I think is really kind of amazing.
That's awesome.
Potential there.
Yeah, thanks for giving us that little nugget. I appreciate that. I think my audience will definitely look that one up and check it out. So Kim, it's been fun catching up. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for coming on the show. I know you're doing a conference up here in June, so I'll be seeing you then. You got any other data points this year that you are excited about?
I'm going to make a few trips for international capitalists. I'm going to go to Uzbekistan.
Nice.
Which is a country that's evolving quickly. And no, offhand, Jay, I wish I could tell you something more exciting, but
when are you guys opening the International Capitalist newsletter for new subscribers that might be interested in after hearing our little conversation here?
We'll be opening in mid-May, and if you go to stansberrychurchouse.com, and we have a free daily e-letter, you'll certainly hear about it there. And no, I wish I could give you a better address or a URL, but I can't.
No worries. So in addition to Stansberry Churchouse on the website, where else is a good place that people can find you and connect with you? I don't know if you're on any of the social stuff or not, but is that the website is the best place? Or?
The website is the best place.
Yep. Okay, got it. Well, cool. Thanks for coming on, Kim. We appreciate it, and looking forward to obviously seeing you up here in Hong Kong and hearing about your next international capitalist trip. And we'll certainly link up the website for our listeners so they can sign up for the free daily newsletter and basically just keep an eye out on when you guys launch your or open up the card again.
Excellent. Thanks so much for having me on, Jay.
All right, great. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. All the show notes and links can be found over at jkimshow.com. Come back often and make sure you subscribe, rate, and review. Don't forget to join us next week for another exciting episode of The Jay Kim Show. I'd love to hear your comments. You can find me on Twitter at jaykimmer, JAYKIMMER. See you guys next week. This podcast is brought to you by Hack Your Fitness, the high achiever's guide to getting ripped in under 3 hours a week. If you're anything like me, you're probably working a full-time job or jobs and trying to find time to balance family life, social life, and last but not least, fitness. Look, I get it. I'm a full-time investor and entrepreneur myself, and father of 2. So how am I able to stay fit year-round without spending hours and hours in the gym killing myself on the cardio machine? After struggling for the last 15 years trying every workout and diet under the sun, I finally designed a system that allows me to achieve and maintain single-digit body fat for life in under 3 hours a week. Cardio not required. Head on over to hackyour.fitness and download my free 13-page guide that teaches you the simple science behind efficient fitness and smart nutrition and gives you everything you need to know to finally take control of your life. That's hackyour.fitness.